It is late May 1869, and the Dog Soldiers, a splinter group of Cheyenne warriors led by Tall Bull, have begun a bloody raiding sweep along the Solomon and Saline rivers in northern Kansas. After murdering a dozen unsuspecting settlers, including one George Weichel, they then captured the man's young wife Maria, who had just arrived from Germany. Soon thereafter, the raiders surrounded a woman by the name of Susanna Alderdice, who was pinning laundry to a line near her homestead. They slew her two eldest children, then carried the pregnant mother and her infant daughter into captivity. Because of its continuous wailing, the Cheyenne later dispatched the baby and left its body for the coyotes. In response, Major Eugene Carr of the 5th Cavalry, guided by William F. Cody, set off in pursuit. Well into June, the column, which included a large party of Pawnee led by Majors Frank and Luther North, trailed the hostiles up the sandy Republican River and deep into Colorado territory. On the 10th of that month, fresh signs indicated that the Cheyenne were not far off. Cutting clear from his supply train the following day, Carr and some 250 men rode quickly with the intention to attack. By late afternoon, the column neared the South Platte River. When they had reached the breaks of the Platte Bluffs, the Pawnee guides reported seeing two hostiles on horseback, then recommended that Carr take his whole command down into the ravine, which was done. They then galloped for an hour through the low sandhills with no sign of Indians, at which point a Pawnee guide caught sight of a herd of animals some 4 miles off in the distance. The Pawnee quickly stripped themselves for the impending fight, taking off their saddles and much of their clothing, and when concealment was no longer possible, Major Carr placed the leading companies in parallel columns of 2, then sounded the charge. A mile from the village, they were still yet undiscovered. The leading companies with the Pawnee on their left cantered their horses at speed, while the rest followed at a fast gallop. Luther North, in his personal notes on the event, described how the horsemen unexpectedly came upon a young Cheyenne boy who was herding horses. He was perhaps 15 years old, and the cavalry closed in on him before he had even seen it. Despite this, he jumped on a horse, gathered up his herd, and drove them into the village ahead of the cavalrymen, who had begun shooting. His mount was good, and he could have easily escaped the charge if he had simply left the herd. But instead, he conscientiously shepherded the animals back towards the village, before turning his steed to join a band of warriors that had been scrambled to meet the charge, and with them he died like a man. As the cavalry thundered down, the weight of the charge carried the men into the village where the fighting became fierce. Luther North then observed a good-looking woman come crawling out of a lodge, who, falling at the feet of one Captain Silenus Cushing, threw her arms about his legs. They immediately discerned that she was a white woman, bleeding horribly from a bullet wound through her midside. Despite her incoherent sobbing, the soldiers realized straight away that she couldn't speak any English, and therewith took her to be the captive German woman, Maria Weichel, while some 20 yards away, the body of Susanna Alderdice lay crumpled in the long grass, her small head buckled in from a tomahawk blow. By early evening, the remaining Cheyenne had moved to the head of a narrow canyon close by. But whenever the cavalry detachments attempted entry to it, arrows would rain down upon the men, wounding several. But the soldiers refused to retreat, and after a few hours of heavy volleys by both sides, the arrows no longer came. After the smoke and dust had cleared, 52 Indians lay dead, including Tall Bull, shot from his pony by Frank North. When William Cody brought the war chief's steed back to the Indian camp as a trophy of war, Tall Bull's wife gave a piercing shriek and began beating her breasts and face. After some later inquiry by interpreters, it was found that the captive European women had been murdered and wounded by this woman, in the words of another squaw, from pride and envy. The devastating charge at Summit Springs broke the back of the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, and never again were they a force on the western frontier. Today, both heritage Americans and European nationalists can draw some parallels from this gripping episode of the Plains Wars. Like the last American Indian nations, we are now beleaguered on all sides by seemingly impossible odds, arrayed against us in the forms of hostile civic institutions, a hateful mainstream media, an embedded liberal dictatorship insinuating itself within the halls of power, and relentless minority factions whose revolutionary worldviews are totally dependent upon white cultural eradication. But there is one vital difference, however. We still own greater numbers, which means more than ever, we must win the ongoing culture war by securing the loyalty of our own kind by any means, while distancing ourselves from enemies. By examining the actions of the 5th U.S. Cavalry at Summit Springs, we must view this situation in a fundamental way. A few American frontiersfolk were butchered by belligerents, fairly commonplace for that time, so any kind of reaction was possible. But the government, and more significantly, the local authorities, saw this as intolerable, with particular alarm given to the abduction of 2 white women. Thus, they spared no expense or manpower, and brought every political and military expediency to bear, in the hope of bringing justice to the slain. This was how our American forefathers handled things, without considering the consequences of their actions, because existential notions were black and white, and protecting their own blood, while maintaining the honor of the group, was the moral standard. Now just imagine what we, as a united nationalist front, could do if we too had these principles guiding us today. No assembled force could stop us, and in fact, none would even dare.